June 25, 2009. Los Angeles. Paramedics burst into a rented mansion on North Carrollwood Drive. A 50-year-old man lies motionless on a bed. Within hours, the news will stop the planet. Text messages jam cell networks. Twitter goes down. Google briefly thinks it's under attack because so many people are searching one name at once. The most famous entertainer who ever lived is gone. But to understand how it ended, you have to understand the boy who never got to have a childhood, and the star who spent the rest of his life trying to get one back. Long before the world knew his name, there was a small house on Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana, a steel town choking on its own smoke, where a former boxer named Joseph Jackson worked a crane at U.S. Steel and dreamed, bitterly, of the music career he never had. He had 9 children. He would build his ambitions on top of them. Michael Joseph Jackson was born there on August 29, 1958, the 7th of those 9. By the time he was 5 years old, he was already rehearsing, for hours, night after night, in a living room turned into a boot camp. Joseph Jackson would later admit, in interviews, that he beat his children as discipline. Michael, decades later, would describe those years to journalists and in his own writing as terrifying, moments where he'd vomit from fear before rehearsals, where a misstep meant a belt. That's the part the posters never showed. Because on stage, none of it looked like fear. It looked like magic. By 1964, the 5 Jackson brothers had a group. Michael was the youngest and the smallest, and somehow the one nobody could stop watching. Even grown musicians who worked with them early on would later say the same thing. The kid moved and sang like someone twice his age who had lived twice as much life. There was something unsettling about it, and something magnetic. By 1968, Motown Records signed them. Berry Gordy, the label's founder, personally oversaw their introduction to the world, staging a now-famous story that Diana Ross had discovered them, a piece of Motown mythology the company built to launch them faster. And it worked. And by January 1970, an 11-year-old boy was standing at the top of the Billboard Hot 100 with I Want You Back, the first of 4 consecutive #1 singles for the Jackson 5. He was a child prodigy the entire world could see. What almost nobody could see yet was the child underneath. But that wouldn't stay hidden forever. By his teenage years, Michael was already restless inside the Jackson 5's format, polished, but boxed in. Motown controlled the songs, the sound, even the outfits. He wanted more control, more sound, more risk. In 1975, the Jacksons left Motown for Epic Records, a defection that strained relationships and required them to leave the Jackson 5 name behind, since Motown owned it. They rebranded simply as the Jacksons and kept moving forward. In 1979, Michael found a producer who understood exactly what he was chasing. Quincy Jones, who he'd met while filming The Wiz, a big-budget flop of a movie musical that nonetheless became one of the most important accidents of his career because it's where he and Jones connected. Together they made Off the Wall, a record so far ahead of disco's collapsing wave that it produced 4 top 10 hits and turned Michael Jackson, for the first time, into a solo force to be reckoned with as an adult artist. Critics loved it. Fans loved it. And Michael, by his own later account, was still furious it didn't win Album of the Year at the Grammys. He said that snub lit a fire in him that never really went out. It should have been the peak. It wasn't even close. Because 2 years later, Jackson, Jones, and songwriter Rod Temperton would walk into a studio to make something that had never existed before, and nobody involved, not even Jackson, fully understood what they were about to unleash on the world. Long before the world called it the best-selling album of all time, it almost didn't happen the way we remember it at all. Thriller was released on November 30th, 1982. At first, it climbed the charts like any other big record. Early reviews were strong, but not seismic. For a few months, it looked like it might simply be a very good follow-up to Off the Wall. Then MTV happened. The network, still new and still overwhelmingly built around white rock acts, was resistant to playing black artists' music videos. Jackson's label pushed hard. Accounts described direct pressure from CBS Records threatening to pull all its other artists' videos if MTV wouldn't play Jackson. When Billie Jean finally aired, it didn't just get airplay. It changed what a music video could be, and it kicked a door open for an entire generation of black artists behind him. Then came Thriller itself, a 14-minute short film, directed by John Landis, that turned Jackson into a red-eyed, transforming creature dancing through a graveyard with an army of the undead. It cost roughly $500,000 to make, an outrageous sum for a music video at the time. Executives thought it was reckless. Some religious groups criticized Jackson, a devout Jehovah's Witness at the time, for the occult imagery, and he reportedly had a disclaimer added to the start of the video, distancing himself personally from any belief in the occult. It became the most influential music video in history. Thriller, the album, sold over 60 million copies worldwide and remains the best-selling album of all time. It produced an unprecedented 7 top 10 singles. Jackson swept the 1984 Grammys, winning a record-setting 8 awards in one night, still a record for a solo artist at a single ceremony. That same year, he debuted the moonwalk on national television during a Motown 25th anniversary special, performing Billie Jean in front of Motown's founders and his own former label mates. Millions of people who saw it live said afterward they felt they'd witnessed something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. He was 25 years old. He was the most famous person on earth. But fame at that altitude comes with a price nobody warns you about. And Michael Jackson was about to start paying it. In 1984, while filming a Pepsi commercial, pyrotechnics misfired and set his hair on fire, burning his scalp and requiring multiple surgeries. He would later say the injury led to a dependence on painkillers that stretched across much of the following decade, a detail that becomes important later when you understand how his relationship with prescription medication never fully went away. In 1987 came Bad, the long-awaited follow-up to the best-selling album of all time. An impossible task, and Jackson knew it. It still produced 5 number-1 singles, a record that stood unmatched for years, and its title track and accompanying short film, again directed by a major filmmaker in Martin Scorsese, tried to answer the pressure the only way Jackson knew how. Bigger, sharper, more ambitious. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, something else was happening, visibly, publicly, and impossible to ignore. Michael Jackson's face was changing. Tabloids seized on it immediately, mocking him relentlessly. Jackson himself gave few clear answers for years. What is documented? He underwent multiple rhinoplasty surgeries, and in 1986 he was diagnosed with vitiligo, a condition that causes patches of skin to lose pigment, something he confirmed publicly in a 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, after years of speculation and cruel jokes about his skin tone lightening. He also stated he had lupus, which affected his skin and contributed to his sensitivity to sunlight, which is part of why he was so often photographed with umbrellas, masks, and gloves in public. The tabloid nickname that followed him for the rest of his life, Wacko Jacko, was born in exactly this period. Coined by British tabloids, it stuck to a man whose eccentricities, whether genuine or manufactured by relentless press coverage, made him one of the most parroted figures alive. Stories about a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, about trying to buy the bones of Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man, about his pet chimpanzee Bubbles traveling with him, some exaggerated, some outright fabricated by his own team as pranks on the press, some true, all blurred together into a single caricature that made it harder every year to see the person underneath the headlines. He built Neverland Ranch in 1988, a 2,700-acre property with a zoo, amusement rides, and a movie theater. He said it was the childhood he never had. The press covered it as proof he'd lost his grip on reality. In 1991 he released Dangerous, moving away from Quincy Jones for the first time and producing it largely himself alongside Teddy Riley, chasing the sound of the new jack swing that was reshaping R&B. It debuted at number 1 and included Black or White, a song and short film about racial harmony that became one of the most watched television events of the year when it premiered, though a controversial sequence showing Jackson simulating aggressive movements led to public criticism and an unusual public apology, edited out of later broadcasts. Both of those things, the wonder and the way the world reacted to it, were about to collide with something far more serious. In August 1993, a 13-year-old boy accused Michael Jackson of child sexual abuse. Los Angeles police and the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department opened a criminal investigation. No criminal charges were ever filed. In January 1994, Jackson settled a civil lawsuit brought by the family, reportedly for around $23 million, without admitting wrongdoing. This is where the story requires precision rather than drama. The settlement ended the civil case. It did not constitute a criminal conviction, an admission of guilt, or a legal finding of innocence. It remains, to this day, one of the most disputed and consequential chapters of his life, cited by supporters as proof of extortion against a wealthy target, and by critics as evidence something had gone deeply wrong behind Neverland's gates. In the middle of that storm, in May 1994, Jackson married Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's only daughter, in a secret ceremony in the Dominican Republic. The marriage lasted less than 2 years and was the subject of enormous public skepticism about its motives on both sides. Skepticism both of them pushed back on publicly, including in a joint televised interview. They divorced in 1996. In 1995, Jackson released History, a sprawling double album, one disc of new material, one of greatest hits, that opened with a 5-minute spoken word and orchestral piece confronting his own persecution narrative head-on. Its lead single, Scream, a duet with his sister Janet, became one of the most expensive music videos ever made and directly addressed his anger at how the media and legal system had treated him. Whatever people thought of the message, the album debuted at #1 in over a dozen countries. It also contained lyrics on the song, They Don't Care About Us, that used language widely condemned as anti-Semitic. Jackson apologized and re-recorded the lyrics for the final release. In 1996, he married Debbie Rowe, a dermatology nurse, and together they had 2 children, Prince Michael Jackson Jr. and Paris Jackson, before divorcing in 1999. A third child, Prince Michael Jackson II, nicknamed Blanket by his father, was born in 2002 via a surrogate. Jackson would later describe his children, in interviews, as the thing he was proudest of in his entire life, and he went to unusual lengths to shield their faces from cameras throughout their childhoods, often having them wear masks or veils in public. That same year, in November 2002, Jackson caused an international uproar when he held his infant son Blanket over the railing of a 4th-floor hotel balcony in Berlin to show fans below. An incident widely condemned as dangerous and later addressed by Jackson himself as a mistake made in a chaotic moment. A second and far more serious legal storm was already building. In 2003, Jackson was charged with multiple counts related to the alleged abuse of a different boy, a cancer patient he had befriended through the Make-A-Wish Foundation, after a British television documentary showed Jackson holding hands with the boy and discussing having previously allowed children to sleep in his bedroom. The case went to a full criminal trial in Santa Barbara County in 2005, one of the most heavily televised trials in American history, with camera crews camped outside the courthouse for months. On June 13, 2005, a jury acquitted Michael Jackson on all 14 counts. Legally, the matter was resolved. Culturally, it never fully was. For the rest of his life, and in the years since his death, the allegations have remained a permanent, unresolved shadow over his legacy, one that documentaries, journalists, and fans continue to debate today. What's certain is that after 2005, the man who once seemed untouchable would never fully recover his public footing, professionally or personally. And behind the scenes, something else was quietly collapsing: his health and his finances. After the trial, Jackson largely left the United States, living for a time in Bahrain, at the invitation of a member of the country's royal family, and later in Ireland. His finances, meanwhile, had been deteriorating for years, a mix of Neverland's enormous upkeep costs, lavish personal spending on art, antiques, and real estate, and loans secured against his most valuable asset, a stake in the Beatles' song catalog he'd purchased back in 1985 for roughly $47.5 million, a deal that had stunned the industry and reportedly strained his friendship with Paul McCartney, who had reportedly encouraged Jackson years earlier to invest in music publishing, not realizing Jackson would eventually outbid him for the very catalog McCartney co-wrote. By the mid-2000s, Jackson was reportedly hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Neverland Ranch faced foreclosure proceedings in 2008 before a deal restructured his debt at the last moment, with Jackson ultimately transferring his stake in the property to a trust rather than losing it outright to foreclosure. He needed a comeback. Not creatively, Commercially, survival. In March 2009, promoter AEG Live announced a stunning number, 50 concert dates in London, titled This Is It. Tickets sold out in minutes, reportedly setting a record for the fastest sellout for a single artist's run of shows. It was framed, publicly, as the greatest comeback in music history, a chance to rebuild both his reputation and his finances in one stroke. Behind the scenes, rehearsal footage later released as a posthumous concert film shows a 50-year-old man who could still move like no one else on earth. His voice, his choreography, his instincts for staging all intact and sharp. But he was also, according to multiple accounts from those close to him in his final months, exhausted, alarmingly thin, and increasingly dependent on the propofol he reportedly used to help him sleep, administered nightly in his home by a personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, who had been hired specifically for the tour at a reported $150,000 a month. Nobody watching those rehearsal tapes knew they were watching the final weeks of his life. On the morning of June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was found unresponsive at his rented Los Angeles home. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead at age 50, just over 2 weeks before the first This Is It concert was scheduled to take place in London. The Los Angeles County coroner later ruled his death a homicide, attributing it to acute propofol intoxication combined with other sedatives. In 2011, Dr. Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and served 2 years in prison, and lost his medical license. The world reacted the way it had reacted to almost nothing else in the internet age. Traffic to news sites and social platforms spiked so dramatically that several, including Twitter, briefly slowed or crashed under the load, and some reports at the time suggested even Google's servers registered a surge that its systems initially flagged as a possible attack. Millions watched his memorial service at the Staples Center on July 7, 2009, broadcast live around the world. His daughter Paris, then 11 years old, stepped to the microphone through tears and said the words that would end up defining how the public remembered him in that moment, that he was, simply, the best father anyone could imagine. It was a devastating final image. But it wasn't the full picture either. In the years since his death, Michael Jackson's legacy has become one of the most contested in modern pop culture, pulled in two directions that refuse to reconcile. On one side, the artistic record. Thriller remains the best-selling album ever made. He is credited, alongside a handful of others, with turning music videos into an art form, breaking racial barriers at MTV, and building a live performance blueprint. The choreography, the stagecraft, the sheer scale of ambition, that Beyoncé, Justin Timberlake, Usher, and countless others openly cite as their template. His humanitarian single, We Are the World, co-written with Lionel Richie in 1985 to raise money for famine relief in Ethiopia, became one of the best-selling singles ever released and raised more than $60 million. Posthumous releases, a Cirque du Soleil show, and a This Is It concert film have kept his catalog commercially dominant for over a decade after his death. On the other side, the 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland, in which two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, alleged in graphic detail that Jackson sexually abused them as children in the 1980s and 90s, both having previously testified in his defense during earlier legal proceedings before later reversing their accounts, reopened the public reckoning with force. Jackson's estate has strongly denied the allegations and pursued legal action against the filmmakers and HBO. In the wake of the film, some radio stations pulled his music, some museums and franchises quietly distanced themselves from his image, and public opinion split sharply along lines that mirror the broader cultural reckoning of the #MeToo era. There is no clean ending here. That's the honest truth this story owes you. Michael Jackson's story isn't a fairy tale, and it isn't a simple cautionary tale either. It's the story of a boy who was never allowed to be a child, who became the most famous performer alive before he was even a teenager, who reshaped what popular music and live performance could look like, and whose adult life became inseparable from serious, disputed allegations that remain unresolved in the public's mind to this day. Any honest account of Michael Jackson has to hold both of those truths at once, not to excuse either one, but because pretending only one of them exists isn't storytelling. It's myth-making. And the real story, as it usually is is far more complicated than the myth.